Hey, good evening and welcome to Real Talk. I am your host, Ron Strand. We are glad that you're joining us tonight, and we've got a great show for you. I am excited to have Governor Mike Huckabee with us tonight. It's something that I've talked about and we've promoted for a while, and tonight's the night, and we are honored that he is joining us. He served as the 44th governor of Arkansas, 2 terms, and he's run for president on the Republican ticket for the Republican nomination on 2 occasions. He is the host of the Mike Huckabee Show. He's got a lot of other credentials that we're going to talk about tonight. He's also got a daughter who served as President Trump's press secretary, and we'll get into that a little bit too. But would you please welcome, and I'm honored to welcome, Governor Mike Huckabee. Governor, thank you for joining us.
Well, Ron, it's a pleasure to get to visit with you, and looking forward to the conversation tonight. You know, I heard what you said about we have a very special guest. All of our guests are special. And I was thinking, yeah, you say that to all your guests. But
you say that to all the girls, right?
All the girls. That's right. Yeah.
That's so true. But, you know, I am excited, and you're somebody that I have admired. And by the way, Governor, I love the beard. I love the beard.
Thank you.
You're looking like a rock star.
I don't know about that.
Which I know,
as long as I don't look like Fidel Castro, you know, I'm going for the ZZ Top look at some point, maybe.
You got,
but I've told people that if the economy continues to sputter like it is, I'm going to have to moonlight as a department store Santa this winter. So I'm getting a head start on the look.
Well, yeah. Well, at least you're getting prepared for it.
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to get into tonight some of your background and give the folks kind of a background. You've been on the public stage since the 90s, or before that, of course, in Arkansas, but on the national spotlight. And, you know, we want to just kind of get to know the man behind the persona, a little bit about you, your background. I know your faith plays a tremendous part in your life and in your career, and we'll get into a little bit of that. But let's just kind of start at the beginning and give the folks a little insight of where you grew up and what family life was like, and maybe some of your early memories of faith and church and those kind of things.
Well, Ron, the Reader's Digest version, as much as I can give one, I was born in a little town called Hope, Arkansas, down in the southwest corner of the state, population 8,000. It was a town no one had ever heard of until Bill Clinton ran for president, because he was born there. Right. Even though he didn't really grow up there, he grew up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, but he was born there. And it sounded good to say, I believe in a place called Hope. That sounded really, really good for a campaign, you know, to base it on hope.
Yes.
But I grew up in a family that quite frankly, like a lot of families during the period of the 50s and 60s, were pretty doggone poor. We didn't know how poor we were because a lot of other people were too, but I could figure it out that other kids had nicer homes, they had nicer clothes, they got to take vacations, they had newer cars. And we lived in a little shotgun brick rent house on 2nd Street. And, you know, my father was a fireman, and on his days off from the fire department, he worked as a mechanic. He never finished high school, got through the 10th grade. In fact, Ron, no male upstream from me, not my father, grandfather, great-grandfather, anywhere above, had ever finished high school. I was the first male in my entire family lineage to graduate high school, much less go to college.
Wow.
So, you know, I grew up where the expectations were reasonably low. You know, it wasn't like, now, son, one day you'll be the governor. In fact, when I was 8 years old, my dad said, now, son, there's a new lake that's been built by the state, and the governor is going to come down and make a talk and dedicate that lake. And I'm going to take you down there to hear the governor make his talk, because, son, you may live your whole life and you may never see a governor in person. Because we lived over in a corner of the state where politicians didn't really bother to come. And I'll never forget, you know, I saw the governor of the state at a distance, of course, but I thought that was a big deal. And if someone had told my dad, well, you know, your boy's going to live in the governor's mansion, I'm sure he would have said, do they let the gardeners actually live on the property like that?
Yeah.
So, you know, I tell people when there's any discussion of the American dream, is it possible for a person who has no family history of exceptional success of any particular kind, is it possible that a person can go well beyond where he started to a different stopping place than people would have expected? I said, well, my life is a great example of that. And it's not because I'm smarter or better, but I do know that by God's grace, I was born in the United States of America.
Yeah.
And because of good mentoring and good teachers and people in the community that took an interest in me, and getting a job, working from the time I was a little kid, because I didn't have an option. If I wanted baseballs or BBs for my BB gun, I didn't go to my dad and say, hey, would you open up your wallet and shell out some dough?
Yeah.
It was more like when I take my little red wagon, go around the neighborhood, pick up pop bottles and go turn them in for 2 cents until I had enough to buy a baseball glove or BBs. And that's how that worked. I sold cards door to door, whatever it took. Ron, the worst job I ever had as a little kid was catching chickens. A lot of chicken houses in South Arkansas. The truth is, we were 9, 10, 11 years old. And if OSHA had existed then, this was before the days that OSHA even existed.
Yeah.
I'm sure that people would have been arrested for child slave labor, because that's basically what we were. We would go out at 10 o'clock at night in these chicken houses, and it's the nastiest thing you can imagine. I won't describe it. I'll just let your imagination run wild.
Yeah.
But we'd work all night in these chicken houses, running and catching chickens and stuffing them in these wooden crates where they'd go to the slaughterhouse and end up at Colonel Sanders. I look back on that, and here's what I can tell you. It was a wonderful thing to have that experience, not because I enjoyed it, because I hated it. And every night when I'd get finished, I'd say, what do I have to do so I don't have to do this for the rest of my life? Yeah. And I'd always get the same answer. You got to get a good education, work hard, and treat people right. Yeah. Well, I determined as a small child, I'm not sure what else I'm going to do. By golly, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life in a chicken house. Yeah. So it was a great motivator. And I'm grateful to God that I didn't have things handed to me.
Yeah.
But I lived in a pretty normal family, typical American family in the South that believed in old-fashioned values. I tell people my father was a very patriotic man. Yes. He'd lay on the stripes, I'd see the stars. That kind of patriotism, it was a firm discipline in our home. So we knew what the rules were, and yet we lived in that community a life like Mayberry. People didn't lock their doors. We'd get on our bicycles in the morning. As long as we were back by dark 30, we didn't have a cell phone. We couldn't call and say, hey, we're going to be a little late. We just needed to show up for dinner. Yes. We lived in a different time, a time that I am so grateful that I had. But I also lived in a time where if I got in trouble 16 blocks from my house, by the time I got home, 7 people had called my parents, and 4 of the people who saw me probably spanked me before I ever got home. When you hear people say it takes a village, well, the whole village got involved in every kid's life.
Yes.
But what a great, a great community to grow up in. And I took it for granted when I was a small child, because I thought everybody lived like that.
Sure.
But being poor was not a disadvantage. It was an advantage, because I didn't have this sense that, it was all about what somebody could give me. I understood the nature of hard work, and I appreciated the things that I ended up getting or working hard to achieve. So I'm blessed beyond measure, but grateful to God to have been born in the USA.
Yes, indeed. And, you and I are very close to the same age. And while I didn't grow up in a small southern town, I grew up in Southern California, but many of the things you talk about, I relate to. Taking empty bottles and turning them in for cash, mowing people's lawns. You just don't see that kind of thing anymore. And so growing up in the 60s, pretty much, probably the more of the years that you remember, what are some of the, by the way, I wanted to ask you, did your father live to see you become governor?
He missed it by 3 months. Oh. And in fact, my father died 26 years ago today. Wow. So, he didn't see it, but he thought it was coming because I was lieutenant governor.
Sure.
The governor was going through a trial for whitewater-related felonies.
Yes.
And he knew that if that conviction came down, I would be the governor. Now, he thought I would be. And I said, Dad, there's no way that a jury in Arkansas is ever going to convict a Democrat governor with a Republican in the wings to take his place. It's just not going to happen. He thought it would. He was right. I was wrong. And I became governor in July of 1996 when the governor had to resign. So, I've often said I wish he could have seen it, but I believe he did see it from the best seat in the House.
Sure.
And, I can't even imagine how he must have felt. Because, as I said, he never believed that a kid like me could amount to much more than anyone else in the neighborhood. How could it?
Yeah.
But thank God we don't live in a place where we're limited by how we started.
Yeah, that's so true. And so he had the opportunity to see you going from taking you as a small boy to see the governor of Arkansas to seeing you just before you entered the governor's mansion. But growing up in the 60s, were there what events would you say impacted you most from a cultural standpoint? I mean, you growing up in the South, you saw segregation, you saw, of course, we all saw the moon landing, we saw all those events. But what are some of the events that most stick out in your mind that help shape your worldview?
Sure. Ron, I think the Kennedy assassination certainly had a huge impact upon me, as it did everyone who can remember that day. We'll never forget it, that whole weekend.
Yep.
You mentioned the moon landing. I also would mention the riots in 1968. I look back on that time, and I really wasn't sure that America was going to make it. When people talk about how divided we are now, I'm thinking, we've been there before. And we've seen people burn their cities down and light their streets on fire and fight the cops in the streets. It's not totally new. Doesn't make it any more pleasant. But we've seen what happens when there is such a great divide. If there's a big difference between 68 and what we saw maybe with the Antifa riots around major cities back in 2020, the big difference was that there was a universal disdain among what I would call the political, religious, even entertainment establishment.
Yeah.
That everyone saw that it was a chaotic lawlessness that was hurtful to our country.
Yeah.
What I saw in 2020 was that many political figures actually openly supported the rioters and thought that what they were doing and the manner in which they were going about their protests was perfectly okay. And that was very troubling.
Yes.
But that was a seminal event, I think, for me and for the country was 68. It also was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated.
Yes.
Vietnam was at full tilt. So those were some tough days. And it was the time when I was becoming a teenager. So, my teen years are right in the middle of this. You mentioned race, and I grew up in the Deep South. Jim Crow was very much alive and well when I was a small kid.
Yes.
But by the time I got to high school, actually junior high, we had full desegregation. And, it's interesting. People always maybe think that the South is this very bigoted, prejudiced place. It honestly was not. The kids did great. We did great. We made it work. Yes. There were parents and grandparents who, couldn't understand how this was going down. But it really was far better than people ever imagined.
Yes.
Not that it was easy. And I frankly believe that the kids who were Black had a much harder time because they were the ones whose schools were taken out of service, and they had to give up their mascots and their campuses and to merge with the previously white high school. And I can only imagine the frustration and the pain that some of them went through, saying, we're not going to have our same mascot anymore. We're going to have to. We won't be the entire football team or the basketball team.
Yes.
So there were a lot of things that were painful parts of that process. But I also can tell you that this notion that in the Deep South that everybody was racially divided. My gosh, Ron, my family was about as poor as many of the black families.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like I'm going to look down on somebody who's living the same life I'm living. That doesn't make sense.
Sure. Yeah, and I think like what you were saying with the younger generation, I think overcame that, I guess you would say, more so than maybe the generation before us, because I'm sure you saw, I mean, I remember as a kid on a family vacation, even going through Texas and seeing colored drinking fountains and colored restrooms and things like that. And so, down in Arkansas, I'm sure you saw those, the remnants certainly of those things.
Well, we did, and it was repulsive. Even as a little kid, there was something that just, and whether people believe this or not, I think that most of the kids my generation had a natural aversion to it and realized this just isn't right. Black kids are sitting up in the balcony of the theater. They have a different waiting room at the doctor's office. They have to enter a different door and eat in the kitchen if they go to a restaurant. A few did. And it just seemed odd and weird. Like, how come they don't just sit in here with us? You'd ask your parents questions like that.
Yeah.
And, it's just like the only answer we would get would be, well, that's just not how we do things. And it wasn't like my parents would have never, oh my goodness, if I ever had said something disparaging about a person who was black, I'd have been knocked to the floor. And if I didn't say, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, please and thank you, didn't care what color somebody was.
Yes.
They would never have tolerated me using epithets for people of color. That just wouldn't have been acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And doing some research for this, I didn't realize that you have such a background in broadcasting, news, radio, and so forth. I mean, I know that's where your career is right now. But you took your first job at a radio station to read news and weather.
I did. I got a job at the age of 14 at KXAR Radio, which is a 1,000-watt daytime radio station in Hope, Arkansas. Mm-hmm. It was such an incredible just gift. And the manager of that station, Haskell Jones, who is one of the great influences of my life, not only was my boss, but he was a great inspiration. He loved the country. He loved his community. One of the most patriotic people. Oh, my gosh. I've never seen anyone who loved America like he did. And I just thought, well, everybody feels that way. And he used all the resources of the radio station to help the people of the community, which I thought, well, sure, they all do that.
Yeah.
But the big thing for me, Ron, was that's a pretty heady responsibility to be 14, get a key to the radio station, go out on the weekend and open it up and sign it on and run the thing. I look back and I'm thinking, my gosh, I've got a son who's in his mid-40s. I wouldn't give him a key to a radio station right now. What were they thinking back then?
Yeah.
But it was the greatest blessing, because that's where I learned not just the responsibility of work, and that's a serious responsibility, because if you make a mistake, everybody in town, because everybody's listening, they'll all know you did. Yeah. So I did sports, news, weather, made commercials. That's what paid my way through junior high, high school, and college. And when I got to college, I worked 40 hours a week at a radio station. Wow. And took all the hours they would let me take. And I got through my bachelor's degree in 2 years and 3 months. And I tell people, it wasn't because I was smarter than all the other people I was at college with. I was just a whole lot poorer than they were. So they could afford to take 4 years or 5 with daddy's money. I was paying for it. Yeah. So I sat down with a catalog and figured out what is the shortest amount of time that a person can finish a degree. And that's what I set out to do. But I had to work almost around the clock to get it done. You know what that did for me, though? When I hear people talk about multitasking and they act like it's something new, I said, we didn't know what to call it back then. We just called it working your backside off. But that's what I learned. And I learned to be able to manage a lot of different things because I had a goal. I had something I had to get done. And once again, what may have seemed to some people to be a disadvantage was the greatest advantage that I ever could have been blessed with.
That's really a great perspective to see how your upbringing as being on the lower income level had really pushed you even
Yeah.
harder to do what you did. And then you entered the ministry in 1972, but you graduated from I want to say Ouachita. Is that how you say it?
Ouachita. Yeah, it looks
Ouachita.
like it's an Indian name, but it's
Yes,
pronounced Ouachita. Doesn't
Ouachita.
look
Of
at
course it
all
does.
like it's
Yeah.
pronounced.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Ouachita Baptist University, and so growing up in the South, of course, Southern Baptist, I'm sure was the basic evangelical denomination that was prevalent there, because I know you grew up a Southern Baptist. And what attracted you to the ministry? Because you studied religion.
I really never thought I would be a pastor. I wanted to go into Christian broadcasting. That was my career goal, with the ultimate goal to get into politics. So, I mean, I look at my life and I'm thinking, well, I pretty much have touched base with a lot of stuff I set out to do.
Yes.
But the pastorate was never a goal. It was never part of the plan. That happened rather accidentally, if you will, but from God's perspective, it was absolutely providential.
Yeah.
And we can talk about that in a minute. But the turning point for me, ministry-wise, I'd become a believer attending a vacation Bible school when I was 10 years old. And I have to be honest, Ron, it wasn't spiritual motivation that took me to Bible school.
Mm-hmm.
My sister had gone the day before, and she said, "You ought to go to Bible school." I said, "Nah, it's for sissies." She said, "Well, they play baseball in the breaks, and you get all the cookies you want and all the Kool-Aid you can drink." And I suddenly thought, baseball, Kool-Aid, cookies? Yeah, I'll go. So I went. I found out they didn't think I could eat more than 2 cookies or drink more than 1 cup of Kool-Aid. But, that was the time when the pastor of the church came in and he talked to us about what it meant to trust Jesus. And when he was talking about that, I mean, I'd been to Sunday school, but this was something totally different. This was a personal relationship with Jesus. And I'm thinking, I don't have that. I'm 10 years old, so it's not like I'm going to repent of some huge sins. I hadn't sold drugs on the school campus or anything.
Yes.
But you're still a sinner, and you know it.
Yeah.
And I remember when he said, if you want to pray to receive Christ into your life, I'll lead the prayer. And he said, just lift your hand. And I'm thinking, I'm not lifting my hand, because everybody will know, and they'll laugh at me and point at me and make fun of me. I said, but he can't keep me from lifting my heart. So as he prayed out loud, I just prayed, and it was so overwhelming that when they said, let's go play baseball, I sat down on the steps of the church and I said, no, I can't play. And they said, how come? And this is just weird, but I remember I looked at them and I said, because I don't want to get dirty. I felt so clean inside that my translation of that was, I don't want to get out there and get all dirty, because I just got cleansed. And I couldn't really relate the difference between the spiritual cleansing and the physical.
Yeah.
But that's how overwhelming it was. Now, fast forward, because I wish I could tell you that from that moment forward, I just, was a solid disciple. But I actually grew up in a small little missionary Baptist church, and it was pretty, let's just say it was very fundamental, but it was also lovely people. But there was only a basic doctrine that said, get saved, go to church, go to heaven. That was it.
Yeah.
Nothing about walking with Jesus, nothing about being filled with the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
And by the time I was 15, I was about ready just to walk away. And part of it was my frustration with the music of the church. I mean, I'm a typical kid from the 60s. I want to hear rock and roll.
Yes.
And all they play at church is, classic hymns sung out of key most of the time, banging a piano. And it's just like, please, this is just killing me.
Yeah.
And I thought, if this is all there is, it's not enough. I want more. Yeah. And I was invited to be a part of a discipleship group that was led by a lay couple. They weren't being paid to do it. They weren't on staff of a church. He was a heavy equipment operator. She was a housewife. And every Wednesday night, they would invite 10 high school students to come over to their house, just to have an informal Bible study using the materials from Campus Crusade for Christ, the 10 Basic Steps to Christian Maturity.
Yes.
I'd never heard this stuff before. It was the most revolutionary. This was in the midst of the Jesus movement.
Yeah.
And I know that's part of your background too, Ron. So,
Sure.
you know, you and I can relate to that. But
Yeah.
it was transformational for me. I'm suddenly believing, well, this whole Jesus thing is not just going to church. This is about a life. This is about a complete surrender. Man, nobody ever told me that before. And then the beauty was that there was Christian music that was coming along about that time.
Yeah.
Larry Norman, Love Song,
Sure.
you know, music that spoke to me.
Yeah.
And I suddenly thought, I can be a Christian and listen to music that has a godly message, but is put in the vernacular of something I can not only understand and relate to, but that I actually enjoy. And all of those things were so hugely important for who I became and where I am today.
Yes. Well, you know, that's really an interesting point, because as you know, we came out to Nashville to interview you for the Love Song documentary that we're doing. And because you and I share similar backgrounds from that time period, one of the things that's been resounding with so many of the people that we've talked to on this to interview on this documentary is it was the music of the Jesus movement, because the church wasn't offering it. You know, I think that's one of the things that's probably underrated or under talked about, if you will, for that movement, because that music really reached out to young people and made it where, wow, I can relate to this church, rather than, you know, a blue hair lady, no offense to that, but behind an organ or piano and singing hymns out of key, that we had our own music suddenly, and we could relate to it.
It was revolutionary. And I mean, literally revolutionary for the spiritual direction of the country. Look, so many kids, you and I both remember, Ron, that young people were hurting and they were hungry. They saw the conflicts of their country. They saw conflicts in their parents. Our parents, our generation lived with parents who wanted so much to protect us from a World War II or from the horrors that they had lived with of the Depression.
Yes.
And they wanted us to have things they never had. And even when they couldn't give them to us, they wanted us to have those things. But we grew up, it wasn't that we didn't want things, but we also saw that's not all there is to life.
Yes.
And we saw the conflicts of race. We saw the conflicts of anti-war protest.
Yes.
People deeply divided, angry, hostile.
Yes.
And I think there was a yearning. And so many young people went the way of drugs, and, because it was available. I was blessed. I didn't go there, but friends of mine did. And they did it because of that hurt deep inside.
Yes.
And here comes music that even before they realized it was Christian music, it was just music they liked.
Yeah.
And then they listened to the words, and those words took them to the cross.
Yes.
Those words took them straight to the gospel.
Yes.
And God used the music of the Jesus movement, I think, more than he did the preaching. I don't remember a lot of preaching.
Yeah, I do.
To be honest with you, I don't remember much preaching during the Jesus movement that said, boy, that really woke me up. Maybe other than Bill Bright and Billy Graham at Expo 72. I remember those messages vividly. But beyond that, I remember no sermons, but I remember music.
Yes. And it was the music that opened your heart to the message as well, So it had a twofold purpose, but you're right. It was the music that just brought you in. And I share that same experience. So you spent a number of years, from about 1980 to 1992 in the ministry, and two different pastorates at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Pine Bluff, and then at Beach Street First Baptist Church in Texarkana.
Right.
What were the things that you took away from that? Because I know you wrote about the human condition, human suffering of ministering to people during that time.
Ron, I think as I look back, this was God's sort of major graduate school for me to go to. As I said, I kind of accidentally backed into the pastorate because it wasn't sort of my plan.
Sure.
And I was doing running an ad agency, a Christian-based ad agency, doing mostly work for churches and various Christian organizations. I was ghostwriting books. I was doing TV and radio commercials and all sorts of stuff communication-wise. And there was a church that asked me to come and speak at a banquet, and I did. And then they said, "Hey, could you come and speak at a special Sunday for us?" Well, yeah, I can do that. And then they said, "We're without a pastor. Would you be open to being our interim pastor?"
Mm-hmm.
Well, I could do my advertising and communications business during the week and, go speak for them on Sunday and be their interim pastor.
Yes.
So I did. And I said, when you guys find your guy, then just tell me and I'll buzz out of here. And so about 5-6 months later, they came to me and they said, "Well, we found our pastor." I said, "Well, great. When do you want me to, end my time here?" They said, "Well, we wanted to talk to you about that because we think you are our pastor." And I said, "No. No. Not, you guys don't seem to understand.
Yeah.
I am not your pastor. I'm just filling the gap here."
Yes.
And they said, "Pray about it." That's a dangerous thing to do. Start praying about stuff.
Yes, exactly.
So, I realized it was a very specific, very evident call. God said, "Look, I have a purpose for you here." Now, I ended up being a different kind of pastor because I didn't have the typical background. We started the television station at that church. And because that's what I knew how to do. I knew how to do television, radio. We did a lot of different things. The church exploded in growth. We created a community television channel. And more importantly, though, than that, was that being a pastor put me in touch with people at every level of human life.
Sure.
And, when I would hear people later, when I got into politics and people say, "Well, pastors don't belong in politics because they don't know anything." And that was sort of the rub. And I said, let me tell you something. There is nobody in your community who is more in touch with every social pathology that exists in this country like your pastor. Because whether it's a teenager who's just found out she's pregnant, hadn't told her parents, whether it's a young couple that lost their 2-year-old to cancer, if it's an older couple and they're struggling to figure out, are they going to cut their medicine in half because they can't do that and pay the rent on their house. It's a young family where there's fighting and the divorce is imminent and kids are going to be split all over the place. I said, you can name any social pathology that exists: drug addiction, alcoholism, domestic violence, and a pastor can put a name and a face on every single one of those things because he's seen it, he's dealt with it, he's touched it. So I said, what I believe is that there's nobody better prepared to deal with the real issues that humans are dealing with than the pastor, because he's the only person that stood there and held the hand of the person at 2 a.m. in ICU, standing there with the family as their loved one slips into eternity. And there are not many insurance people or attorneys or
senators
who have ever done that. So it deeply humanizes and I think quickens the spirit in a person to have lived those experiences. And it gave me a sense of balance that a lot of people in politics I never felt had. They saw things in harsh tones, and people were, all or nothing kind of attitude. Well, that's not life. Life isn't like that.
Exactly.
And there's some wonderful people who have some deep, deep hurts and sins. And there's some people that everybody looks down on that have some phenomenal qualities that nobody ever saw.
Isn't that true?
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right in the sense that, the people that say, well, pastors should not be involved in politics or churches should. And you write in your book, and the name of the book eludes me because it's one of your 2 books, but in the beginning you talk about the founding fathers, the Pilgrims coming here for religious freedom, establishing a government that has a God-centric element to it. All the early universities were Christian universities. It was in the town square. And so we've moved so far away from it, haven't we? From that for some reason, if you have faith or if you're of faith, then you really have no place in politics. That's such a misnomer and it doesn't even reflect history.
It really doesn't. And so many people have completely reversed the meaning of the phrase Thomas Jefferson used with the Danbury Baptist Association when he said there should be a separation of church and state. And when he talked about this wall of separation, if people just simply read what he actually said, he did not say the church ought to keep its nose out of the government.
Right.
He very explicitly said the government ought to keep its nose out of the church.
Yes.
It was very clear that whole idea of separation of church and state was that the First Amendment guaranteed the freedom of the expression of one's faith. And the government had no business telling people what to believe or how to believe it, how to worship. And if anything, this was hands off from the government.
Yeah.
But the church was to be influential because, after all, Jesus said we're salt and light.
Yes.
And I've often used just the reminder that salt in the day of Jesus was a preservative.
Yeah.
And if things are spoiling and putrefying, like the fish coming out of the Sea of Galilee, the example that he used, you don't keep the salt in a barrel. You put the salt on the fish. And anything that is spoiling, that's what you put the salt on. Anything that is dark, that's where you turn the lights on. So if there's darkness in our culture, darkness in our political realm, and boy, is there ever,
oh my gosh,
who should be there? But the salt and the light, that's what we need more than ever.
Yeah, yeah. I think another thing that I wanted to highlight is that when you were in the pastorate, the mid-'80s, you encouraged your all-white congregation at Emmanuel Baptist Church to accept Black members. How did that go over for you?
Well, I'll never forget the Sunday because, when we had a young Black person that I had led to the Lord, and, he said, I want to come to church here. And I said, absolutely. Of course you could. And I'm thinking, well, this will be really new. It's a 100-year-old church with a lot of old people who lived during the days of some deep segregation. Sure. And this was a community in which those were deeply rooted ideas.
Yes.
And I stood before the church when he came forward, and I said, this young man has come. Our church is responsible for helping him to come to Jesus. What a thrill and honor that is. And I said, I know that you join me in welcoming him and are thrilled that he's come. And I just said it that way, like, don't you dare tell me you're not excited. Yeah. Well, there were about 7 old guys that got up and walked out.
Really?
And later that week, I got death threats, and there were several who called and said they wanted to see me, and they sat me down and said, we're going to dry up the finances of this church. You may think you have done something here, but we'll see to it. And it was very threatening. I was like 26 years old. I was a kid. But right. I thought, by golly, if you guys want to bankrupt the church, knock yourselves out. Because I refuse to tell a person because of the pigmentation of his skin that he's not welcome. And I even said in front of the church, I said, if we were to say to this young man that he's not welcome, we basically told Jesus we don't want him in the church either. That's and right. I said, I don't want to be a part of a church like that. Yeah. Well, here's what happened, Ron. It was a beautiful thing because that month, after these guys threatened to bankrupt the church and kill its finances and get everybody to quit giving, the church had its record offerings in 100 years.
Oh my gosh.
We had the highest number of people starting to come to the church. And I'll never forget, there was a man, he was 82 years old, one of the old deacons. He asked to see me before service about 3 weeks after this all happened. It's hard to tell it without even getting emotional because, he'd lived through the worst of segregation in the South. And he came into my office and he sat down and he said, I always wondered what I would do and what I would think if a Black person came to our church. And he started crying and he said, I now know what I'll do. I'm going to welcome him and realize that God brought him here. Yes. He was just bawling. Wow. And I thought, if God can touch
Yeah.
an 82-year-old man and break the prejudice that was embedded into him, then we've got a strong gospel. And it was breaking chains, just breaking down strongholds.
Yes.
So I look back on that as an important time, and it was a lesson God taught me. Don't be afraid. There are going to be times when you will be threatened, and times that it will look as you're all alone, and that you're taking a stand, and you're going to be out there by yourself.
Yes.
And I'll be honest with you, there were a few along the way that I was.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what
absolutely.
I really learned was be a leader, take the stand your ground, and let the consequences be what they are. They might surprise you. But even if they don't, even if you are obliterated by the stand you take, you can look in the mirror and you can face yourself, and you can look toward heaven, and you can face God with a clean conscience.
Boy, amen to that. And one of the things, Governor, that I've always admired about you, and I've admired you since you've come onto the national scene, your convictions. You're not afraid. You have a way of conveying your faith without being offensive. I mean, I know sometimes the gospel's offensive, indeed.
Yeah.
But I want to read something that Dr. James Robeson wrote about you, because I know you worked for him early on in his televangelist organization. But he said about you, his convictions, meaning Mike Huckabee's, shape his character, and his character will shape his policies. His whole life has been shaped by moral absolutes. And I would say that as what I've seen in your public life, that's absolutely true.
Well, that's a wonderful comment by James, who's had a big influence on me, and a dear friend, remains to this day as a dear, dear friend.
Yes.
The term that he used, the moral absolutes, I believe really are rooted in my my music. And this will be something you will understand, Ron, as a musician, but a lot of people may not have ever thought about it. But before one can play a song, there's something that has to be done as a prerequisite, and it's tuning the instrument. And I don't care if a person is Eric Clapton, one of the great guitar players of all time. He's got to tune his guitar before he cuts loose on Sunshine of Your Love. He just has to, because if he doesn't, it's not going to be this incredible piece of music. It's going to be a train wreck, because everyone who plays an instrument, whether it's the trumpet, the piano, a guitar, whatever it may be, has to tune the instrument. And then the question, what do you tune it to? Well, you don't tune it to what you think, feel, or believe. You tune it to an absolute, the absolute tone of that note. And it's the same exact tone, whether you're tuning it in Tokyo or Tupelo. It doesn't matter. It's exactly the same. So I've come to understand that God's word provides for us the tuning fork. And if we tune our lives and get it in tune to the absolutes that God has laid out for us, our lives will make music, if I could use that analogy.
Yes.
But if we don't, and if we tune, as so many younger people do today in our culture, they always start by saying, well, let me tell you what I think. Let me tell you what I believe. Let me tell you what I feel. And I'm thinking, nobody cares what you think, feel, or believe. It's not about what you think, feel, or believe. You're 19 years old. And I'm sure you're a wonderful person, but your whole life experience is not such that the world ought to be tuning itself to you. You're just not that big a deal. I've said that to some Ivy League college campuses. It's been an interesting repartee, to say the least.
Yes.
But I truly believe that Christians have sometimes been so afraid to take stands because they'll say, oh, people will be angry. Yes, they might.
Yeah.
But, deep down, people understand when you help them to realize, okay, what are you tuning your life to? What are your absolutes? And when people think about it, they say, quite frankly, mine don't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. Folks, thanks for watching part one of our interview with Governor Mike Huckabee. We were intending to go 1 hour with him, but there was so much there. He was gracious enough to agree to another hour with us. So tune in next week, because we're going to air Part 2. Thanks for watching.